Welcome back, everybody. My name's Naomi Feinberg, and I have the pleasure of co-chairing this exciting session entitled Problematic Use of the Internet with my colleague and co-chair, Ms. Margherita Zenoni. The growth of digitalization and use of internet technology has, of course, brought many major advances for society and health, but it also has important downsides. This session was convened in response to growing global concern about problematic usage of the internet and its public health and societal costs. One recent analysis reports that around 7% of the world's population is showing signs of being addicted to the internet, and the prevalence seems to be growing, especially amongst young people. Increased awareness of the association between problematic usage of the internet and mental disorders in general, and in particular, the negative effects of social media use on young people, has led to calls for more action to protect vulnerable individuals, and in particular children and young people, from online harms. So I have enormous pleasure in introducing Professor Marc Potenza from Yale University, a world-leading expert. In fact, I can't think of anyone better to talk to us about this important issue and address some of the many key issues for us in the field. Marc is Stephen M. Southwick Professor of Psychiatry in the Child Study Center and of Neuroscience at Yale University School of Medicine. He chairs the Division on Addictions Research at Yale University and acts as Director of the Yale Center of Excellence in Gambling Research, as well as Director of the Women and Addictions Core of Women's Health Research at Yale, and as Director of the Yale Impulsivity and Impulse Control Disorder Research Program. He's also working with me and other members of the BAP as a co-lead of a Lancet Psychiatry Commission global action on problematic use of the internet to develop societal and health policy changes. Marc has kindly agreed to talk to us for about an hour and then to answer questions from the audience for about half an hour, and that part of the session will be co-chaired by Margherita. So we aim to end at 7 o'clock. I'm sure there'll be a very enthusiastic Q&A session. And then finally, I just want to mention that after this session at 7, please stay around as we'll be announcing the Public Communication in Psychopharmacology Awards immediately after this session. It'll be a brief awards ceremony to allow us plenty of time to get across to the Whitworth Gallery. So without more ado, Marc, over to you.
Thank you, Naomi, for that very kind introduction, and thank you for having me here at BAP to talk about problematic usage of the internet. I have a series of disclosures with respect to relationships with pharmaceutical, gambling, gaming, nonprofit, healthcare, and legal entities. And as was mentioned, while the internet has made life more convenient and more efficient and more entertaining for many people globally, there's also been concern about how digital technologies in general might be impacting individuals in a negative way, particularly developing youth. And a number of organizations that try to protect the public health, like the American Academy of Pediatrics, as well as the World Health Organization, have considered how digital technologies may be woven into people's lives in a healthy and a developmentally appropriate fashion. But there's also a growing recognition that digital technology uses, particularly excessive or interfering patterns, may be impacting mental health in many ways. And so Martin Paulus, myself and others reviewed some of the literature thinking about the mental health and neuroscience findings and provided a framework, Bronfenbrenner model adapted conceptual framework for considering how digital technology usage may operate from the individual, biological, molecular level through societal levels, and how these may change over time because there have been important events like the COVID-19 pandemic that have altered the ways in which many people have interacted with digital technologies. Now, in any new and emerging area, often initial studies are cross-sectional in nature, and to get a more full understanding, it's helpful to have longitudinal data. And one study that's been undertaken that has incorporated screen media activity measures is the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, or the ABCD study in the United States, involving over 21 sites distributed across the United States, and recruiting at baseline over 11,000 9 to 10-year-old children with brain imaging measures every 2 years and other behavioral self-report measures on an annual basis, parental measures as well. And in some of those initial baseline findings, Martin Paulus and colleagues looked at screen media activity in relationship to brain structure and function, found that one particular class that emerged from the analyses was a high frequency group that was linked to cortical thinning, or more mature brain state, among the 9 to 10-year-old children. And there were also relationships with psychopathology observed in the high frequency screen media activity group. So we, as more data emerged, we looked at some of these brain behavioral relationships and used a machine learning approach to look at data from the first 3 waves of ABCD. And we also wanted to determine the extent to which some of the findings might generalize, so we used an independent data set and applied a similar approach, particularly as the Human Connectome Project development data set used similar measures of screen media activity. And what we found was that a 2-factor solution was identified, where a little more than a quarter had this video-centric high-frequency screen media activity pattern observed in the 9 to 10-year-old children, with the remainder in a low-frequency group. So what was this video-centric pattern? It's displayed here for the types of activities on both weekdays and weekends. And the orange color is the high-frequency group, the blue color, the low-frequency group. And one can see that it's mainly for specific types of screen media activity where there's a high frequency observed in the high-frequency group. And this is for video game playing or watching TV or movies on weekdays and weekends. So we were also interested in some of the correlates of these 2 groups. And we found that the video-centric high-frequency group showed poorer neurocognitive performance, more total behavioral problems, more severe prodromal psychotic symptomatology, higher impulsivity, and more sensitivity to punishment and reward, and was more likely from a sociodemographic perspective to be male, Black, Hispanic, and of other race and ethnicity. So if we controlled for the sociodemographic factors, we also observed some of these relationships persisting. And they can be shown here for the neurocognitive measures in this circle plot, where the distance away from the center indicates higher odds, closer to the center, lower odds. And again, the blue color is the low frequency group, the orange-red color, the high frequency group. And what we can see is that the high frequency group scored higher on measures of impulsivity and behavioral activation, lower on measures of crystallized and fluid intelligence, lower vocabulary scores, lower reading scores, among other findings. And this is in the 9 to 10-year-old children. These findings largely persisted over the 3 years of the follow-up. We also saw differences in mental health, and here the high-frequency group showed higher odds of internalizing and externalizing concerns, particularly with respect to the externalizing concerns like conduct concerns, oppositional defiant, ADHD symptomatology, and others. Now, one of the questions that arises is the extent to which one factor may lead to another. Having the longitudinal data, we can model the data, for example, in random intercept cross-lag panel models to look at the extent, in this case, looking at relationships between screen time, sleep, brain structural neurobiology, and their sequential associations. And so some of the findings from that article are listed here, where DIMS is difficulties in initiating and maintaining sleep, and externalizing and internalizing concerns are considered. And what is shown here is this bidirectional relationship, particularly with internalizing concerns and difficulties initiating and maintaining sleep. But we also see that as the children mature, there are these cross-lag relationships with externalizing problems leading to further concerns with sleep and internalizing problems. With respect to screen media activity, what we observed was a more limited cross-lagged relationship where, for example, in the 9 to 10-year-old children, high-frequency screen media activity was related to externalizing problems 1 year later, which was then related to higher frequency screen media activity the subsequent year, as well as more internalizing problems. So there are these complex relationships as children are maturing through late childhood. But as children move from being children into adolescence, there are brain changes that occur. For example, B.J. Casey and colleagues have proposed that subcortical brain regions involved in motivational drive mature more rapidly than prefrontal cortical brain regions, leading to this risk-taking and emotional dysregulation period of adolescence. And at least in the United States, but this is more of a global phenomenon, these data are from the United States, the Pew Research Center found that in recent polling as of a couple of years ago, 95% of high school age students had smartphones. And importantly, the proportion of high school age students who reported being online almost constantly essentially doubled in less than a decade. So 24% in 2014 to 2015, going to 46% in 2 consecutive years in 2022 and 2023. And different groups of individuals report being online almost constantly. So Black and Hispanic youth have higher proportions, as well as older adolescents in the cohort. Now, I mentioned that we wanted to determine the extent to which this high frequency video-centric pattern of screen media activity replicated in another data set. And the Human Connectome Project data set spans from ages 5 to ages 21. And to observe the replication with this video-centric pattern, we looked up to age 12, where we saw the replication. But from 13 and higher, we saw a different pattern, which was largely socio-communication-centric, where texting and chatting and using social media sites were more predominant. And there have been debates about the pros and cons of social media with respect to allowing people to connect, particularly during the pandemic. But oftentimes people report feeling more lonely as they may have their own personal experiences being compared with what people post online, which tends to be the top 5% of their activities. So particularly as individuals like developing youth who may be vulnerable and seeking their own sense of self, this may put them at risk for internalizing concerns like anxiety and depression, as well as others. So there have been concerns raised about the age appropriateness of both social media and the content. There have also been concerns raised about the algorithms that are used to direct content to individuals. And there have been documentaries like The Social Dilemma, where a group of people who were working in the industry left because they did not feel that it sat well with them ethically, the approaches that were being taken. So with teens, the social media that is consumed tends to change over time. And so recent data in the United States suggests that some social media sites like TikTok, Snapchat, and Instagram tend to be more highly utilized. And one can see that for Facebook, going from 2014 to 15 to 2022 and 2023, there's a significant drop-off as Facebook is seen now more as an older individual's platform for consuming social media. So if we can consider, for example, TikTok and mental health, there was a study looking at TikTok videos and the proportion of videos that were looking at mental health concerns. And about half of these videos were mental health related. And this has raised concerns about the extent to which the content is helpful or not helpful, because people have advocated that for some individuals, like people with ADHD or autism spectrum disorder or other concerns, they may find a community where they can share information. And other people have raised concerns about the quality of the information and the potential harms that may come about from inaccurate information being communicated. So if we look at the individuals among the high school students who report being online almost constantly, TikTok has the highest proportion, and particularly the highest proportion of the people who are viewing TikTok. So it raises questions about whether there are aspects of TikTok like the For You information that is being individually provided, the endless scrolling features, or perhaps other aspects that are particularly engaging. And it may be particularly engaging for certain groups of individuals, as in the United States, the Hispanic youth population in this survey was the group that appeared to be online almost constantly, most on TikTok. There are also some sex differences that are particularly noteworthy, for example, for TikTok, where girls versus boys say that they're online almost constantly. And these data, in some ways, resonate with some of the sex differences that we observe globally. For example, in this meta-analysis, we found that this is looking at male versus female predominance, where internet gaming disorder showed male predominance, internet addiction somewhere in between the two, and problematic use of social media or social media addiction was predominantly female in nature. We've also used the ABCD data to look at relationships with ADHD and online social activity. And again, looking in random intercept cross-lag panel models, we were trying to determine the extent to which online social activity led to ADHD symptomatology or vice versa. And what we observed was that as children moved from late childhood into early adolescence, there was a more unidirectional relationship where online social activity led to ADHD symptomatology, but not vice versa. And this effect seemed to be particularly predominant in girls, as seen in the bolded area, going from time 2 to time 3 and time 3 to time 4, but not in the boys. However, the extent to which ADHD symptomatology is linked to problematic use of the internet is also relevant to boys. These are data coming from South Korea, where we looked at at-risk, high-risk problematic internet use in middle school aged boys. And what we found was that At baseline, about 15% of the youth met criteria for at-risk, high-risk problematic internet use. 1 year later, of that group, 85% had remitted without intervention, but a new group of about 12% of youth emerged. And if we looked at the factors that were linked to transitions, it was the amount of time spent gaming and cognitive and hyperkinetic features of ADHD, where either emergence or remittance was related to the emergence, for example, was linked inversely to fewer days of internet gaming, and the ADHD symptomatology was linked to the emergence, as well as for the remittance, hyperkinetic features of ADHD were inversely related. Now, given these and other data, the U.S. Surgeon General in the United States put forth a guidance on social media and youth mental health. He has also called for social media platforms to include product warning labels akin to what exists for tobacco and alcohol use. And so this is how the United States had been considering some of the ways in which they've been considering social media use and youth mental health. But what have the main nomenclature systems been doing with respect to internet use behaviors? In anticipation of the DSM-5, Time magazine had this article where it asked what counts as crazy and what is the new abnormal, where internet addiction was one of the main topics. And so this raises the question as what is problematic usage of the internet? And it's been put forward as an umbrella term, like substance use disorders are for specific individual types of substance use concerns. And these concerns may be in the domains of gambling, gaming, social media use, pornography, cyberchondria, which is searching for health-related information in an interfering fashion, or some that may not fit within a compulsive or addictive framework as well, like cyberbullying. So going back about 20 years, we were interested in understanding problematic usage of the internet in high school students. So we surveyed about 4,000 to 5,000 high school students and adopted the Minnesota Impulsive Disorders interview to assess for problematic usage of the internet, which we defined as an irresistible urge to use the internet, growing tension or anxiety that could only be relieved by using the internet, and trying to cut back on internet use. And what we found was that about 4% of the sample met criteria. It was more common in Asian and Hispanic youth, but in the whole sample was associated with multiple negative health measures, including substance use, depression, and aggression. But when the DSM considered which disorders to include within the DSM-5 related to internet use, it was felt that there was not sufficient evidence to include a clinical disorder, but it was of significant concern to include a research criteria condition. And at the time, the most data existed for problematic video gaming, particularly with massively multiple online role-playing games and other types of gaming that were linked across jurisdictions. There had been reports of deaths in internet cafes in Asia, as well as deaths of children where parents left their infants or young children unattended while they were in marathon gaming sessions. So these criteria were put forth, included in the research section, and were largely modeled after a gambling disorder. We were also interested before that time in problematic video gaming, so we also, independent of adapting the Minnesota Impulsive Disorders interview for internet use, we also adapted it for gaming. And what we found was that about 2 to 3% of the sample had problematic video gaming. If we asked about video gaming in general, Video gaming was a normative behavior among boys, but not among girls at that time. And among boys, gaming, not problematic, but generally, was linked to lower odds of smoking and not related to negative health measures. And it's important to consider that there may be positive aspects of some of these behaviors when not engaged in problematically, which may make discussions with children as they're developing more challenging. And but with the problematic video gaming, we did see a male predominance, and across the entire sample, linkages with substance use and affective concerns and aggressive concerns. So we do want to note that the demographics change over time, and we've also been concerned about girls and problematic video gaming. And the ways in which gaming and gambling have been converging are multiple in nature. So, for example, in the United States, daily fantasy sports is not considered legalized gambling, but it contains many elements that are gambling-like. Same with social casino games and with microtransactions that are embedded in free games where people pay for either extra time or to advance levels. Engaging in microtransaction behaviors can become problematic and has been linked to engaging in what are considered formal types of gambling. And then there can be gambling on gaming through competitive gaming like esports, as well as skins gambling, where skins are items that can adorn weaponry, for example, in video games. They can be non-game enhancing, but still carry significant value in the video game and in real life. And then there are loot boxes and loot crates, which are random elements within video games that can contain skins, oftentimes low value, but some high value. And as such, some jurisdictions have considered loot boxes and loot crates gambling and therefore illegal for youth. In the United States, there have been significant changes with respect to gambling. So the Supreme Court overturned the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, which allowed states one by one to consider legalizing sports gambling. And currently, most of the United States, 39 states and the District of Columbia, have legalized sports gambling. And in the setting of this legalization, there have been there's been more media coverage of gambling lines on the bottom of general sports shows, and more talk about wagering. Some of these platforms like ESPN have also moved into the gambling itself, so it links the two efficiently. And there's also heavy advertising in the United States for sports gambling, which by 2022 reached over $300 million per year, and more recently has surpassed $400 million a year in advertising. Oftentimes, these advertisements include movie stars as well as sports celebrities, and they also advertise what might seem like free money, so risk-free bets or instant bonuses that may be particularly enticing to developing youth or young individuals, particularly young males, as they engage in a sporting culture and competitive risk-taking with their peers. Now, also of note is that the monthly use of sports gambling apps has increased substantially. So if we look, for example, in the January bars from 2021 to 2022 to 2023, we see the numbers going from 2 million to 8 million to 13 million. So it raises questions about whether we should be concerned about this perfect storm, if you will, of events, particularly with people carrying around computers in their pockets where they can gamble anytime, anywhere, on just about anything. And in the year following our state legalizing sports gambling, we saw close to a doubling of calls to our gambling helpline, largely with that increase being attributable to young males with online sports gambling problems, and with about 2/3 of those calls coming from the male himself and about 1/3 from a concerned family member, usually the mother. Another potentially vulnerable group is college students, and it's estimated that about 1 in 10 college students has a gambling problem. This is a time when adolescents often move away from their parents, so the type of supervision that they have over their behaviors changes. And this article in Time magazine shares the lived experiences of a young male, a 33-year-old from Toronto, who reports that 99% of the gambling he had done in the past 5 years had been on his phone, and that now you can be sitting on the toilet and deposit an infinite amount of money. And he accrued several $100,000 in debt before turning over his financial liberties to his mother and going into Gamblers Anonymous and into professional treatment. Now, this is from a 33-year-old, but this high school student on the left, he had won an award for writing an essay on his peers' gambling behaviors. It was published in the New York Daily News, and he was brought on to NBC to talk about his experiences. And one of the things that he mentioned was that there are apps that are not legally gambling, like Flip, where you can go and essentially engage in sports gambling without money, but for points. And like with pachinko in Japan, there are social systems where you can exchange points for money, was his experience. Now, there's also the coverage of gaming in the media, which may attract youth, and also what might complicate discussions between parents and children is that there are some individuals who can make money and as professional gamers. So, for example, there are platforms like Twitch where people can pay subscriptions or get advertising in order to make money for gaming at specified times. So there are some individuals like Ninja who were reported to make $500,000 every month playing Fortnite, doing this through subscriptions and deals and other aspects. But like with professional sports, it's only going to be a very small percentage of people who reach that level of success, but it does complicate discussions with developing youth. And so in keeping in mind with that notion, there are also some positive aspects. And for many youth, as boys and adolescents go through development, gaming can be a way of socially connecting with other individuals that may decrease over time, but for some individuals it may persist throughout development into early, middle, and later adulthood. So again, it's something where we need to be mindful of positive aspects, but at the same time try to keep individuals on a healthy developmental track. And then we talked a bit about the convergences between gaming and gambling. There are also convergences with other forms of digital technology usage. And one of those is between gaming and pornography use. And so this was a naturalistic experiment of sorts when the Fortnite server crashed for about 24 hours in April of 2018. Pornhub reported that the percentage of gamers accessing Pornhub increased by 10%, and searches for Fortnite-related pornography increased by 60%. And so we should be mindful that pornography is a main form of what many people do on the internet. This article that came out in 2017 said that by that time, Pornhub had received over 87 billion views a year, and it linked its parent company at the time, MindGeek, to as being one of the top three bandwidth-consuming companies in the world, with the other two being Google and Netflix. There have been mixed views about how pornography may relate to health, but when people engage excessively or problematically, and this occurs more in males than in females, can become a significant concern. And people have proposed that the availability, accessibility, affordability, and perceived anonymity of the internet has led to an increase in consumption, that for developing individuals, there have been a number of young adult males who report erectile dysfunction in the setting of having their arousal templates being informed by pornography. And like with other forms of internet usage, what I've heard from people in recovery is that it feels like going down a rabbit hole where you get nudges to see more extreme forms of pornography over time. So this concern led to this cover story in Time magazine, and thinking about the age of onset of pornography, this Huffington Post article talked about the inadvertent identification of pornography on the internet by a 7-year-old girl, but there's also the intentional viewing of pornography by underage individuals. And age verification processes can often be subverted. There are data from an internet provider that the proportion of 7 to 12-year-old children over one 5-year period statistically significantly increased as compared to the prior 5-year period. And with these algorithms, there are concerns about the types and patterns as well, with respect to the content, as what was considered more extreme pornography has now become more mainstream. And even among adolescents, pornography-related information searching was linked to the highest odds of problematic use of the internet. And there were concerns then linking problematic use of the internet to a number of mental health concerns. So there have been a number of studies that have suggested that early onset of pornography consumption, like early onset with other potentially addictive behaviors, has been linked to a number of negative outcomes, including longer time needed to reach orgasm and more stimulation needed to reach orgasm, decreased sexual satisfaction, poor quality of romantic relationships, and other negative concerns. But even how youth use social networking to communicate sexual information can be concerning, both from a legal perspective, but also from a mental health perspective. And this documentary, which was made as part of a legal settlement, it's called Audrey and Daisy. And the two girls, Audrey and Daisy, were sexually assaulted as teenagers and then had that information spread through their school's social networks via messaging. At the time of the documentary, one girl had committed suicide. Now both girls, have committed suicide. So I recommend viewing the documentary, but it's not an easy content. So from a more nuanced perspective, the type of pornography may influence real-life sexual relationships, as oftentimes adolescents are asked to engage in sexual acts that they see on the internet. And some people have raised questions about whether this is linked to increasing reports of violence during sex. Now, we were interested in who might be interested in receiving treatment for um, their patterns of pornography use. So we interviewed about 1,500 male viewers of pornography, and about 1 in 7 individuals reported being interested in treatment. Those who were interested in treatment tended to report more hypersexuality as well as longer times consuming pornography or more frequent pornography consumption. Among individuals in treatment in clinical settings for problematic pornography use and compulsive sexual behaviors, we looked at relationships with arginine, vasopressin, oxytocin, and psychiatric symptomatology. And what we found was that psychiatric symptoms had the strongest relationship, and it was a direct relationship with pornography-related hypersexuality. Arginine vasopressin also had a positive relationship, and arginine vasopressin is very structurally similar to oxytocin, but is more linked to aggressive behaviors, oxytocin to more empathic, prosocial types of behaviors. And oxytocin had a positive link to empathy, which then had an inverse relationship with pornography-related hypersexuality. So again, it suggests that these are multifactorial, multi-component types of relationships, but mental health being a significant part of the process. So we've been interested in trying to advance treatments. In this case report, we found that a veteran with problematic pornography use when receiving cognitive behavioral therapy to target that showed decreases in pornography viewing, but increased craving that then with naltrexone subsided. There's also since been a negative study of naltrexone, but some of these initial findings resonated with what we have seen in some studies with gambling disorder, in this case, nalmefene, which was superior to placebo in reducing problem gambling severity with variation in response. We've also looked at a case series of paroxetine, and in this case, paroxetine decreased anxiety and pornography consumption, but also was linked to the emergence of new problematic sexual behaviors with respect to paying for sex and extramarital relations. So it's important to get complete histories when trying to target these behaviors. There have been debates about whether compulsive sexual behavior should be included as an official diagnosis. And in the lead up to the ICD-11, a group of us convened for every year prior to the pandemic, focusing on whether internet use behaviors should be official diagnosis, and if so, how should we define them? With respect to gaming disorder, this was debated in the scientific literature as well as in the general press, where on back-to-back days there were articles, game addict disorder is a moral panic, and then the NHS to open addiction clinic for young online gamers. When it was put forward that the ICD-11 was considering gaming disorder, the gaming industry came out with an official statement saying that they thought it was premature to include gaming disorder in the ICD-11. We wrote back, and as part of this gaming industry response consortium, there were over 120 scholars on this, asking whether this might be a corporate strategy to disregard harm and deflect social responsibility, recalling that in the 1990s, the tobacco executives went in front of the U.S. Congress and testified that they did not think that tobacco was an addictive product. So what happened when the World Health Assembly met in 2019 to adopt ICD-11? Gambling and gaming disorders were included as disorders due to addictive behaviors. Hazardous gambling and hazardous gaming were also included. This is akin to hazardous and harmful alcohol use, which is particularly helpful for public health assessments, as if we think about the triangle small at the top with the most severely effective, but a larger base. And so thinking about risky behaviors is important from a public health perspective. And then compulsive sexual behavior disorder was included, but not as a disorder due to addictive behaviors, but rather as an impulse control disorder, which is where gambling disorder was before there were sufficient data to justify its reclassification. Gaming disorder, there are central elements that include impaired control, increasing precedence given to the gaming such that it crowds out other activities, and continuation or escalation despite adverse consequences. There needs to be significant impairment in one or more domains and a period of 12 months of symptomatology, although there's flexibility with respect to that time frame. Now, as ICD-11 was being considered, I published this case report, if you will, that was based on a newspaper report of a veteran who died while a nurse's aide was playing video games at a nearby hospital, and was putting this forth as perhaps an example as why hazardous gaming might also need to be included. Essentially, the criteria are shown here, but it's gaming that is problematic but does not rise to the level of a disorder. Now, while gaming and gambling and pornography use through compulsive sexual behavior disorder are considered in the ICD-11, there's a wider range of behaviors like social media and shopping and buying that are not considered as formal diagnoses. So a group of us put forward the notion that perhaps this designation of other specified disorders due to addictive behaviors could be used to capture these behaviors and give people a diagnosis so that more information could be gathered and clinical care could be provided. People have also been working on assessment instruments like the ACT-11, which is based on the ICD-11 criteria and assesses for specific internet use disorders related to gambling, gaming, social media use, pornography use, and shopping and buying. As part of a cost initiative that was led by Naomi Feinberg, a free downloadable e-booklet is available called Learning to Deal with Problematic Usage of the Internet. One can go to the web link at the bottom here and download it for free. It's available in multiple languages, and it has gone through at least one updating because this is a rapidly changing area. But it covers multiple types of problematic usage of the internet, information on the course and of problematic usage of the internet and its various types, as well as co-occurring disorders. It covers assessment and intervention and provides practical tips. And a lot of the practical tips are largely directed towards parents with respect to considering age-appropriate content and gradual age-related introduction, both with respect to content and duration, to balance screen and physical activity, to consider how digital devices and screen time might be used in anticipation of bedtime and how to set limits, to encourage parents to be mindful about how they interact with digital devices with respect to modeling, creating tech-free zones. Importantly, this notion of avoiding device use for emotional regulation, I think, is particularly important because this seems to be linked to problematic usage. So giving children the skills, more adaptive skills to regulate emotions and delay gratification may be particularly important. And to have clear and consistent rules and to follow those rules as parents as well. And to have open, curious, and non-judgmental conversations about online activities is really important, particularly prior to adolescence, when children may be more receptive and may they may be particularly receptive. So, and to warn children about online dangers that relate to how information can stay on the internet for longer periods of time. They may be sharing information that in later times they don't want to have shared with other individuals. To encourage help when they feel uncomfortable with material that they may be seeing or reading online, including when they are cyberbullied, and to teach online ethics and manners and safe behaviors. As part of the cost initiative, there was also a consensus guidance about how to prevent problematic use of the internet during the pandemic, as well as recommendations as more data emerged with respect to mental health. But the pandemic did change the ways in which people engaged in a number of behaviors, including with pornography use. In the early part of the pandemic, in March and April of 2020, there were about 10 to 25% reported increases that could have been related to confinement, decreased casual sex opportunities, stress, or other factors, with one of these factors being the role of the pornography companies in terms of making their premium services free at times during the pandemic. So, for example, Pornhub have had this help flatten the curve promotion, where if you agreed to self-isolate or to regularly wash your hands and maintain social distance, you could access their premium services. And what we saw in Italy after that spike is the day after the premium services became free, but then there was a tailing off over time as well. But these, it raises the notion about how the product and the availability of the product and how the product is regulated may influence how people use this, and raises questions about how we as a society might think about these questions. And so there were also other concerning aspects, like by March of 2020, there had been over 9 million searches for coronavirus-related pornography, and the times of pornography consumption increase were often in the middle of the night local jurisdiction time. And what that looks like here, that's shown here in terms of hour by hour, and you can see this 30% increase around 2 a.m. local time, which raises questions about what may be motivating individuals to be viewing pornography at 2 a.m. We also saw changes with respect to gaming, and for example, there were increases by up to 70% or more early in the pandemic. There was also increased viewerships. This led to the WHO coming out and promoting healthy gaming, balanced gaming, to perhaps increase social connection during the pandemic, but not to engage problematically. The gaming industry also promoted gaming to increase socialization and reduce stress. And it's unclear, a lot of these gaming patterns have gone back to pre-pandemic levels, but it also raises the question as to the extent to which this may contribute to development being veered off of trajectory. And so we were participating in a study at the onset of the pandemic, which suggests that relationships with mental health changed during the course of the pandemic for different types and patterns of problematic internet use. So we're looking at problematic gaming and problematic smartphone use, where at the wave 1 to wave 2, we saw that problem gaming was linked to subsequent psychological distress in the middle school age children. But that relationship from wave 2 to wave 3, as the pandemic became entrenched, was no longer significant, but rather problematic smartphone use was linked to more distress, perhaps because developing youth were using their smartphones to gather information that was unsettling or disturbing for them. Speculative, but important to note that over time there can be events that change the relationships between types of internet use and mental health concerns. So as Naomi had mentioned, she is leading a Lancet Psychiatry Commission report on problematic usage of the internet, where one of the major concerns is how do we find the appropriate balance between promoting individual civil liberties with societal responsibilities and institutional duties of care to protect the public health. And so this article from 5 years ago by Swanton and colleagues outlines different roles for individuals, families, community groups like teachers and law enforcement groups, as well as treatment providers who oftentimes feel untrained or perhaps they don't have the treatments in their toolkits to be able to most effectively help individuals. There are also roles for researchers to gather more information and to provide that information in a digestible fashion to governments to be able to regulate behaviors, policies, create policies that will hopefully help industry create safer products over time. There have also been other public health initiatives, like Australia has proposed and I believe is soon to enact a social media ban for youth under 16. And this, I think we should be mindful that underage pornography consumption is also banned, but youth engage in the behavior anyway. So it's important, many youth do, it's important to have dialogue and discussion during development to provide developing youth with the skill sets to be able to navigate this environment. There have also been calls for banning mobile phones, and some jurisdictions in Australia have done so, and there have been some initial positive reports by teachers and parents with respect to improving students' concentration and attention and social aspects. We've also recently, earlier this year, published an article in the American Journal on current advances in behavioral addictions that focuses on recent research and how clinical care can be provided. We've generated prevalence estimate. We've reported on the prevalence estimates of these 5 different types of problematic behavior, noting that in many cases, like for problematic use of social media, there's a wide prevalence estimate range which reflects not having a fully agreed upon criteria. We've proposed models that suggest where interventions may target aspects, for example, for internet gaming disorder. There's been data published by Klaus Wolfling and colleagues, for example, of manualized cognitive behavioral therapy, which has been found to be efficacious for people with internet and computer game addiction. There are no FDA or regulatory body approved medications with indications for the behavioral addictions, including for gambling, gaming disorder, or problematic pornography use, compulsive sexual behavior. There are some initial studies that have shown efficacy in small trials, but more work is needed. Similarly, with respect to neuromodulation, some studies, particularly that either transcranial direct current stimulation or RTMS can decrease craving, but the extent to which this translates into behavioral treatment outcomes is less clear. So there have been, over the past 20 years, a number of milestones with respect to research on problematic use of the internet and social media. A number of those are with the DSM and the ICD-11. We also note that one of the prominent models, the interaction of person, affect, cognition, and execution model, which is a relatively complex model. We break it down to, which we did in a subsequent article, to look at stages. Central to this is how people respond to stimuli with respect to affective and cognitive responses that are under some sort of control, that leads to decisions to engage with the internet in certain ways that in early stages is more gratifying and leads to changes in how people expect rewards. But over time, this may lead to more cue reactivity and craving, which is under less control, leading to more habitual behaviors that are more compensatory in nature and lead to cognitive biases and using the computer or internet in maladaptive ways. Now, these are not linear, as we've recently described, and for people who see individuals in clinical settings, that's maybe obvious, but I think important to note. We've also reviewed the field with respect to the Oxford Handbook on Digital Technologies and Mental Health. So in conclusion, the internet has changed many aspects of life. How best to define problematic usage of the internet continues to evolve. Policy efforts are being implemented internationally to prevent harm and promote public health, but we still need to do more research as this is a rapidly changing area, and we need to translate that information into better prevention and treatment efforts. We have an upcoming conference in Nantes focusing on behavioral addictions like problematic usage of the internet, and one in DC next month focusing on digital media and developing minds from the Children and Screen organization. So there have been a lot of people contributing to this work, and I'd like to thank them, the funding organizations, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marc, for this incredible presentation. So rich, so many useful information. Now it's time to open the floor for questions from the audience. Oh, okay. Is there someone? Yeah, with the mic that can go around, take them. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for a brilliant talk. I wanted to ask you about how do you see streamers in all of this? Because on one hand, people that deem themselves streamers, they play video games for a long period of time, or they might go on what appear to be like social activities. A recent example is I Show Speed goes to China, backflips on the wall of China, but seems to be holding his phone, streaming it all of the time. And I know not all of them are successful. Is this considered to be an addiction? And the other question I wanted to ask was about the social contagion effect, particularly the Papageno effect. We know there's the occurrence of mass sociogenic illnesses like with ticks, or the increased risk of suicide or pro-anorexic websites. Where does this sit in all of this? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think those are both really important questions. So there is no official diagnosis related to problematic streaming, but again, if I were a clinician and seeing someone who seemed to be having interference in major areas of life function with what seems to be high frequency engagement in that behavior and that they're continuing it despite adverse consequences, then I would consider the other addictive disorder due to other the ICD-11 term that I had mentioned, that I'm now blanking on myself. The other disorders due to addictive behaviors, that is the term. Other specified disorders due to addictive behaviors. So with respect to streaming, I think it's like with other internet behaviors, where we do need to be mindful of disengaging high frequency engagement without problems from high frequency engagement with problems. There's a literature on this with respect to gaming, because initially people use quantity frequency measures of internet engagement, and there are the relationships, but there are some people who can engage, for example, frequently with gaming, but it does not interfere in the major areas of life functioning. It can sometimes be challenging as a clinician to identify the extent to which that is accurate or not, as people may feel ambivalent about giving up behaviors or particularly for developing youth who may not understand well what the shorter and longer term consequences are. So I think we need to be mindful of making clinical judgment in those areas. With respect to things like suicide and eating concerns um, and to a larger extent, some of the unsafe challenges, like one of the aspects of TikTok are the different challenges, like the Don't Rush challenge, which people speed up putting on makeup, which may have privacy for developing girls issues, or the crate challenge, where people stack crates and see how high they can go and then fall, and there have been injuries with that, or the Kool-Aid challenge with, I don't know if people remember the Kool-Aid advertisement from like the 70s and 80s, where this big Kool-Aid container jumps through walls. Now children are mimicking that and jumping through fences, and some have injured themselves doing that. So there is this contagion effect that can happen and can lead to injury. With I had mentioned with the social comparisons, I think for developing girls and the thinness ideal within many societies, that can also impact eating behaviors and eating related concerns, including things like anorexia. I think these are all things that we need to be mindful of, and how to help individuals navigate what seems to be an increasingly complex environment, particularly as AI becomes more entrenched and chatbots are now a growing concern among youth, and with respect to mental health and suicide.
Yeah, there was another question up there.
Sure.
Thank you, great talk. You have presented a number of somewhat related disorders. I got two questions in this regard. The first one, do they tend to present in comorbidity with each other, or do they tend to present as standalone disorders, and then they might be comorbid with, psychiatric disorders, psychological distress, and so on? The second question is, of all these disorders, which one are you the most worried about, and why? Thank you.
So first question was about with co-occurrence of the different behaviors. They do co-occur. I have seen people with both, with concerns in multiple areas, for example, gaming and pornography use concerns. They can stand alone. They often co-occur with other mental health concerns. And if we look at the data from behavioral addictions that are more well studied, like gambling disorder, where we have national data that have carefully looked at co-occurring mental health concerns. For example, data from the National Comorbidity Survey replication indicate that 96% of individuals with gambling disorder have one or more co-occurring psychiatric concern, and close to 2/3 have 3 or more co-occurring psychiatric concerns. We don't know those data with respect to most of the forms of problematic usage of the internet, but my clinical impression and what I've heard from other care providers is that multiple concerns are generally present. Which I think is most concerning. I think it depends on the individual coming in. I think it's important to assess for, again, in an open, curious, and non-judgmental fashion, and not be, and to try to first ask about how people engage with the internet, and then get a better understanding of that is the best way. I would, I appreciate that clinical time is sometimes precious, and that people have limited time to assess individuals, but I think it would be helpful to try to screen briefly for these behaviors and concerns. And it may also depend on the population group. like young males maybe have particularly problems with gambling and pornography use and gaming, and females with social media use and shopping and buying, but it cuts across different groups.
Thank you, Mark. There's a question from up there.
Thank you very much for this important talk. My question is related to the ADHD, and there was a study about the pathway from gaming to ADHD. So I just wanted to if you could elaborate on whether it is children who have ADHD symptoms that gets reinforced by the use of video gaming, or is it implied that the other way around, that video gaming reinforces behavior that would manifest as ADHD, and in that case, does prevention or treatment and withdrawal have an effect on ADHD symptoms?
Yeah. So the question is about the relationship between gaming, ADHD, and I think that is an area that we still need to understand better. The data that I presented were from, had 2 time points. So the time points were looking more at problematic usage of the internet in general, and not at gaming disorder, but the amount of days that were game free from gaming, was linked to transitions. So in a way that made sense, like fewer days gaming and less problematic usage of the internet. The ADHD symptomatology similarly, but like we did with online social activity and ADHD symptoms in the cross-lag panel models, ABCD should be able to answer similar questions with respect to gaming and ADHD, and we're in the process of doing those analyses. And like with other relationships, it would be great to have independent samples and to determine the extent to which the findings are replicable across different jurisdictions, because how gaming is considered in different cultures may differ. For example, in Asian cultures versus US cultures, it may be different. So I think trying to, and we've modified, for example, the iPace model to consider East Asian data, and how the iPace model may differ with respect to being in a more collectivist versus individualist society and culture, how shame and stigma may be represented in different cultures. It may influence how we consider these behaviors and the relationships.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. Maybe I missed it if you mentioned it. I was wondering if there's a sense that maybe kids or developing youth resort to kind of problematic use of the internet and gaming due to maybe sort of if they come more from kind of deprived environments or non-stimulating. And I guess linked to that, are there kind of other behavioral interventions apart from just banning, I guess, for example, phones, that can be done to sort of, I guess, make real life sort of a bit more kind of interesting?
Yeah. So there are data from different parts of the world on problematic usage of the internet, and lower and middle income countries do seem to have higher prevalence estimates of problematic usage of the internet. And it is a reasonable hypothesis to put forward that disadvantaged backgrounds may link to problematic usage of the internet in different ways. Beginning at early ages, parents may turn to using digital devices as a way to calm and soothe developing youth. And families that are more disadvantaged and may have different work hours or the like may turn to this pattern more frequently. So I do think that looking at the extent to which income may relate to different types and patterns of problematic usage of the internet, as well as other socioeconomic factors, is important. And there was a second part to the question. Or, yeah.
Any kind of behavioral manipulation or intervention was done.
Yes. So I think trying to prevent addictive behaviors in developing youth in general has been a difficult concern for different cultures and societies. So in the United States, we've had, in the substance use field, the DARE program, which finds that youth learn about substance use, but it doesn't change their substance use behaviors. Patricia Conrad recently, over the past decade, she's looked at the factors most strongly linked to adolescent substance use and substance use concerns, and found that factors like emotional dysregulation and impulsivity were among the factors that accounted for the most variance. So she's developed intervention programs to target substance use problems in developing youth, and found that her pre-venture, co-venture study is like 4 to 5 years later, implemented across school settings, links to better outcomes in terms of substance use problems, decreases the substance use problems. So I suspect that something similar, if you teach developing youth skills of how to delay gratification and how to regulate emotions in a more adaptive fashion, that might be a helpful intervention for problematic usage of the internet.
Thank you. I was just wondering, unfortunately, more and more in practice, much like you describe, a lot of our young people say when they're older, they'd like to be YouTubers or influencers or professional gamers. You don't hear lawyers or doctors anymore. And I just wondered, along with that and all the associated sort of behaviors and mental illness that you describe, is there much data in terms of sort of unemployment and reduced, admissions to university and that sort of thing that's potentially seen on the back of problematic usage of the internet? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think that it is, the data are emerging, and they're not as robust as, say, other fields like substance use or schizophrenia or depression or anxiety, because it's a relatively new area and it's changing very rapidly. So there are people with lived experience who report on how they, Cam Adair is someone who founded Game Quitters, for example, and he talks about how, during his adolescent and young adult period, his life went off course by engaging heavily in gaming as his main focus. And so I think there are more anecdotal than firmer data at this point in time, but I think those studies need to be done. But there's, I think, a level of information that we should be concerned about.
Hi. Thank you so much for the talk. It was really engaging. I was just curious because you mentioned naloxone and other similar drugs that kind of try to blunt that reward hit to treat behavioral disorders like that. And with the advent and kind of proliferation of GLP-1 agonists and use of those drugs, which primarily are used obviously to treat obesity and weight disorders, but also seem to have an effect on reward processing. Do you have any hope for pharmacological interventions similar to those to target these disorders, or just generally any sort of development along the line of using drug interventions in addition to treatments from therapy?
Yes. So I think GLP-1 agonists are a very exciting area that may target motivated behaviors that are problematic for people across a number of domains. There are data that have emerged about substance use behaviors, and I'm hopeful that there will be studies done on behavioral addictions.
Thank you so much for a fantastic talk. I was wondering, when people take drugs, it's hard to measure that because often the criminals providing the drugs don't like us measuring that. But online, we can measure a lot. Has that been done, and what have we learned from it? Like individual behavior.
Yeah. So more work has been done in the gambling field than in some of the other fields. And so people like Mark Griffiths and Howard Schaefer have obtained gambling data from different online gambling sites and have looked at, they've tried to develop algorithms, they and others, to try to help identify people with gambling problems early on from their behaviors. And there are types of patterns of gambling behaviors that have been linked to gambling problems from the player data. So I think that it's an area where working together with people in the internet provider area, as well as the companies that are engaged in products on the internet, it could have benefits in terms of helping people.
Thank you, Mark. I know there are still a few questions, but we will have time for one final question, and we have to go in order. I'm sorry. So the lady in green there, it's her turn.
Thank you. And sorry, a really interesting talk. Thank you so much. I had a question about some of the earlier data you presented about screen use in like really young children, like infants, and how you showed some really, really strong associations with that being linked to behavioral problems, during childhood. But with the causality of that, like, could it be that like children who display really difficult behaviors, parents are kind of saying, the only way I can appease my child is if I give them a sort of screen. But some of the demographic covariates you showed with that, I think it can be really easy to sort of blame parents with these things and say, oh, well, if you were just a less lazy parent and you didn't give your kid an iPad. But it's easier to say, like, somebody's really well off and middle class and can send their kid to like a Montessori nursery or something like that. But there's other parents who might have a lot more restrictions on time poverty or might be single parents and are really just doing their best with what's available. For people who have more like limited socioeconomic resources, what other alternatives or like interventions can be proposed to help like break cycles that might be to poor solutions to difficult externalizing behaviors?
Yeah, I think these are complicated concerns. So I do think that with respect to the relationships, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of data are cross-sectional. Even with the longitudinal data, they will show temporal relationships without necessarily indicating causality, as causality can involve, even if they are temporarily related, determining causation is a complicated undertaking. That being said, I'm trying to give parents the tools to try to help give them the information that is available and understand it's not. My hope is that what I presented was not coming across as blaming parents, but rather to try to help parents and children navigate what I see as an increasingly complex environment with digital technologies that oftentimes parents do not feel like they have the lived experience to understand, meaning they grew up in a very different digital technology environment than their child or children is or are. And they may not understand what the impact is. And we may not understand what the impact is, but we can provide them with the data and try to provide the information and tools that I think are trying to promote the parent-child bond and connection, and have an open, curious, and non-judgmental way of communicating with developing children about their behaviors.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you very much for the insightful questions. And Mark, again, thank you very much both for the wonderful talk and for the increasingly relevant work you're leading internationally. Sorry. Thank you very much.